The need for media with integrity is more important than ever. As a licensed member of the media, we have a responsibility and a duty to engage in discussion on topics that are representative of our local, provincial, and national audiences' concerns and interests. We are committed to excellence in our designated format, news, opinion, and commentary. We believe in the lawful, peaceful, diligent, democratic levers of civic engagement, one important tenet of which is freedom of the press, to be facilitators and not censors of debate.
Day schools weren't working that well, but public schools seemed to be a non-starter. Residential schools appeared to be, at the time, the most promising avenue. Now, they showed that they had imperfections too, but as I say, I would have liked to challenge the critics to tell me what a plausible alternative in the 1880s would have been.
Do you remember where you were on May the 27th, 2021?
A clear path forward requires looking back and learning. Good public policy requires human connection. It's a consideration of the facts, applying common sense and innovation. It's urban, it's rural, it's real life. We all have something to contribute. We all have a responsibility to get informed because there's a little piece of Canada in all of us, isn't there? Let's learn on this path together. This is Leaders on the Frontier.
The discovery of the mass grave is gripping the nation tonight. CTV's Travis Prasad now with more on how the country is honoring the 215 lives taken too soon.
As Vancouver's civic buildings lower their flags, so do other parts of the country. In Ottawa, Canada's flag atop the Peace Tower flies at half-mast. Parts of Nova Scotia will lower their flags on Monday. Municipal buildings in Greater Toronto already have. Many will stay this way for 215 hours, 1 hour for each of the young lives lost. In Brantford, mourners placed 215 pairs of shoes on the steps of Canada's oldest residential school.
Part of this, too, was our call to accountability and justice for our missing and our murdered children.
And meanwhile, over the next 2 years, First Nations across the country continued to find similar discoveries of mass graves in a steady drip of announcements right across the country. But is any of this true? Is this significant, horrendous claim of mass graves of children to be actually true? It appears not, so says our next guest, and a myriad of other experts and researchers who've looked at this question carefully. And so with me today, it's my honor to welcome the editor of the book, Grave Error, How the Media Misled Us and the Truth About Residential Schools, edited by Dr. Tom Flanagan and C.P. Champion. So welcome, Dr. Tom Flanagan. He's a renowned author and analyst, and he's also a professor emeritus at the University of Calgary. Welcome, Tom.
I do.
So we're going to get a significant range of questions here, and I want to start off with a number of very basic ones because I think a lot of Canadians were, including ourselves, very shocked on May 27 when this announcement was made. It's hard to believe, going back almost 2 years now, and that they would be shocked that there's no evidence confirming this claim of a mass grave. And so when we look at this, how is that possible? Is there an easy answer to that, Tom?
Well, we know it's possible. It was we have the fairy tale of Hans Christian Andersen to give us the example of everybody praising the emperor's clothes. We're social beings, and people respond to what they hear around them. And when they hear the prime minister and other leading politicians in the country, they hear leaders of their churches, they hear prominent figures in the media and academia all saying the same thing, that a mass grave of murdered children has been discovered. Well, of course, they're going to believe it. They're not hearing anything else. Mm-hmm. Well, we're trying to get them to hear something else, because the truth is that there is no persuasive evidence in favor of what people have been hearing. I can't say categorically everything is false. I can say categorically that no persuasive evidence has been brought forward to to substantiate what are, really very radical claims. The notion that Catholic and Protestant missionaries murdered children, secretly buried them, threw them in furnaces, hung them from meat hooks, on and on and on.
Yeah.
These are really grotesque claims, and I wouldn't think a person would want to believe them without some evidence. But if nobody contradicts it, and if the prime minister and bishops and other people are saying it's true, well, you can understand why people would accept it.
Yeah, no, exactly. So, and one of the context to this is that the last number of years we've gone through quite a process, including the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The report was some 3,200 pages. And I have had the time to wade through this long document. And there's no, to my knowledge, as I recall, no suggestion of mass graves. I know that there was quite an analysis regarding the residential schools, both the good, bad, the ugly. And part of that story within that report was that you had a number of abuses that did go on. There were some, as I recall, 11 persons charged. I'm just utterly shocked that the TRC never asserted such mass graves, and yet all of a sudden, just 2 years ago, they suddenly appear on the radar. Did that surprise you as well?
Well, it's kind of the logical culmination of where this train was going. The precise allegation hadn't been made previously, but there were lots of hints about missing children, not murdered children, but missing children. The Commission of Inquiry produced a list of about 2,500 names of children who had died at the schools. Their definition of dying at the school was a very ample one. It included dying up to a year after having attended. So, of course, that includes a lot of people who may have been involved in a railway accident or, who knows.
Yeah.
But the story had been told, starting going back to about 1990. The story had been repeatedly told that the residential schools were, at best, a big mistake, and that Canada owed compensation to the so-called survivors. So this had been set up for a long period of time. The notion that there had been widespread physical and sexual abuse, that conditions were poor, that there were a lot of unexplained deaths, that children had gone missing. All of these statements had been made. And so what Kamloops does is kind of draw them together into a horrific picture of not just missing children, but murdered children secretly buried.
Yeah.
But as I say, this didn't come out of nowhere. This is like the culmination of something that started with Phil Fontaine's interview with Barbara Frum on the Journal in 1990 and had been building ever since.
So one of the things that's interesting about the so-called discovery of mass graves is the use of a technology called ground penetrating radar. And it's a device to obviously take radar pictures of the ground. And what really does that actually prove anything in terms of evidence? Like, does that technology allow you to identify children and the ages of children and the precise nature of those possible graves? I mean,
No. I mean, it's a legitimate technology. It's widely used in various fields, such as geophysics. It's used in exploration for mines and metals and various things. But what it shows you is probably best described as soil anomalies. It will show you where the waves coming back don't reflect as you would expect them to reflect if the soil was undisturbed. So soil anomalies are called disturbances in the soil. These will show up, but to know what's there, you then have to dig or use some other technology such as core samples. But you have to do something. It doesn't tell you what you've come across. And so this was the first big problem with the Kamloops announcement, that there was no further exploration of any kind. There was no digging. There were no core samples taken. They just jumped to the conclusion that that these were burials. It now seems almost certain that what the GPR was picking up there was the remnants of a sewage disposal system, septic system that had been installed in the 1920s. Kamloops was the biggest residential school in the country. It was always sort of state of the art in its physical facilities. Mm-hmm. And so in the 1920s, they put in what for the day was a modern sewage disposal system with a big tank. And then you have to get rid of the liquids. And the way you do that is you install weeping tiles under the ground. I mean, it's still used today in rural locations. And it works. But so there were miles of these weeping tiles installed under the ground. Then later, I guess in the 1930s and 40s, they were able to hook on to the city of Kamloops waste disposal. So they didn't use that system anymore. And I guess the memory was forgotten, except in government records. Mm-hmm. Apparently, the young woman who was pushing the GPR around didn't realize what was down there. I mean, that's what we can't say for sure because she has never made her report public. She has lawyered up. She's not talking to the media. Questions can't be asked, but it seems very likely that because she said that she was picking up a lot of blips that were in rows that would be like what you'd find in a cemetery. Well, that's a pretty good description of the way they laid the weeping tile. Someday we'll solve this mystery of what she was actually seeing, but for the time being, we have to kind of guess at it. But one thing we do know is that no exhumations took place, and nothing was produced in the way of caskets, shrouds, skeletons, bones, nothing. No, zero.
Yeah. So, that in itself is a revelation that the report, the so-called report from the ground penetrating radar, has never been released publicly. So there's a lot of significant points of evidence and information that you share in this, I think, a brilliant book, Mass, A Grave Error. And I encourage people to read it, to look at it, to debate it, see for yourself what the information is. But what is really profound is that there's so much of this that is just simply not transparent. This is a major claim to make. And of course, all Canadians were horrified by this kind of assertion. And then to make these kinds of claims and then not to release information seems really quite disturbing and, if not irresponsible. So part of the context is you've alluded to the story of the residential schools. Can you help us explain what were the residential schools and what was really happening? Because they really have a long history of some 120 years.
The background to the government getting into this was the disappearance of the buffalo from the Canadian prairies.
Indeed, yes.
In the late 1870s, early 1880s. The buffalo hunt had sustained the native people, both Indians and Métis of the prairies. And suddenly there were no more buffalo.
Right.
They were completely gone. And the government was faced with first of all, a starvation crisis. And their response to that was sending out aid in the form of rations for several years.
And I should just point out, Tom, that was obviously under our first Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald, which in effect saved tens of thousands of Aboriginal people.
Oh yes, of course. He wasn't trying to starve them out. He wanted to save them. And so they spent what was, by the standards of the day, a lot of money. You have to remember that the railway wasn't yet complete. The stuff had to be mainly bought in the United States and then hauled up by cart from Montana. But anyway, rations was one response. Secondly, trying to teach the natives how to farm, and they started appropriating money for model farms and farm instructors. And then longer term, education to fit into a radically different economy. And that's where the residential schools came in. Up until that point, Canada had been kind of bumbling along with the private residential schools that only educated a relatively small number of people, plus some day schools. But after the buffalo disappeared, it seemed to the government of the day that this was a major crisis that had to be confronted. So their solution was a residential school. Now, it may not have been a perfect solution, but I don't know what the alternative would have been. I mean, sending the Indian kids to school in town was tried in a few cases, but did not work well. For one thing, most of the Indians lived far from towns and couldn't just go back and forth. Secondly, they weren't really welcome in local public schools. They didn't pay taxes on the reserve, so they weren't helping to support the schools. There was a lot of racial prejudice at the time against Indians, so the kids would tend to get beaten up in the schools if they did try to go to the public schools in town. So, day schools weren't working that well, but public schools seemed to be a non-starter. Residential schools appeared to be at the time the most promising avenue. Now, they showed that they had imperfections too, but as I say, I would like to challenge the critics to tell me what a plausible alternative in the 1880s would have been. Not what looks plausible today, 170 years later, 150 years later, but what would have been practical in the 1880s. I think that's the issue.
Yeah, so this is a very challenging, complex situation that decision makers face. So part of this was also during a time of tuberculosis. We had smallpox, which the government of the day of Sir John A. Macdonald actually vaccinated Indigenous people. And of course, the Spanish flu was later, but that you had enormous loss of life across the board. This is part of the larger context of the residential school story, is it not?
It is. And here again, I think our book contains some interesting insights on this, particularly work by Professor Ian Gentles, a retired professor of history. He did a careful comparison of mortality rates of what we know in the schools versus what took place in reserves or other Native communities. And yes, a lot of kids died in the schools, but the mortality rate was no higher than it was. Probably better than what it was in the reserves, because in the schools, at least, they often had some nursing care and perhaps a better, more consistent diet. It appears that many children were already infected with tuberculosis when they came to the schools. This was a tragic situation, but again, this is before people had discovered the germ theory of disease. The cause of tuberculosis was not known. It was thought to be bad ventilation or not enough sunshine. And the cure, as such as it was to be sent to a sanatorium and have lots of rest and walks in the outdoors. And sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't.
Yeah, it was the 19th century.
That was the state of play for the entire society. And the Native people did not have nearly the level of herd immunity that the European origin population did, because for them, tuberculosis was a new disease.
Exactly.
It was a killer for everybody, but it was worse for the Native population. So the schools, yes, suffered deaths until, it started to decline a little bit when vaccine against TB was discovered in the 1930s. But the real turning point was late 40s, early 50s, when streptomycin came on. And from that point on, tuberculosis ceased to be a major killer in the schools. It continued to be a minor problem, but it was not like it had been. So so many of these deaths that the Royal Commission listed, the 2,500 or so many of them were caused by tuberculosis, which was, as I say, a disease whose source was not understood and whose treatment didn't yet exist.
Yeah, exactly. So this is a difficult context. And one of the major clarifications I do have, and I think many Canadians might be shocked by this, is that most Aboriginal people did not attend residential schools. It was actually a minority. Is that correct?
Yeah, we don't know how many attended because the Royal Commission didn't do its job properly.
Mm-hmm.
The records exist that you could have come up with a total of how many children were there and for how many years and so on, but they didn't handle the data properly. So from somewhere, and we don't know where, the number of 150,000 appeared.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of these numbers that suddenly appear. Nobody knows, at least so far, I have not been able to discover the source of the number.
Mm-hmm.
It could be plausible, but we don't know. But what we do know is that in terms of who applied for compensation, there were far more people applied for having attended day schools than residential schools.
Mm.
So I think it's pretty clear from various sources of evidence, even though we don't know the exact numbers, that at all times there were more students in the day schools than there were in the residential schools.
And was it mandatory to attend the residential schools?
Up until 1920, it was not mandatory for Indian children to attend any school.
Mm-hmm.
1920, the Indian Act was amended to make school attendance mandatory, but not necessarily residential school. It said the act was amended to read that if there was no day school available, a child could be required to attend a residential school.
Mm-hmm.
So some children, a minority, were required from that point forward to go to a residential school, although the law was not consistently enforced. We know that there were still, as late as the 1940s, there were tens of thousands of Indian children who weren't in any school at all.
Okay.
So the law was not consistently enforced. But I would have to say that, yeah, after 1920, a minority of Indian children were required to attend a residential school. Yeah. So in a limited sense, yes. And then starting, say, from the 1950s on, the residential schools were increasingly used as orphanages.
Mm-hmm.
The death toll, not just among kids, but the death toll among parents was so high in those years that there were a lot of orphans.
Yeah, it was very tragic. Yeah.
Both parents were dead. Kids would often be sent to a residential school. I mean, what exactly were you going to do? It was an alternative to an orphanage, and the government had never set up Indian orphanages, as far as I know. So residential schools became, in effect, Indian orphanages at a later period of time.
So out of the TRC process, and again, I had the pleasure of reading this massive 3,200-page document, and I suspect almost very few have, let alone journalists. But as I read the report, one thing that struck me was how there were many positive experiences at residential schools. It's something you never hear about today. And those came from people who attended. They found an education. There was an opportunity to do a variety of activities as you would find in any school. And we have a whole variety of pictures and documents. I think there's a very famous CBC documentary actually done on residential schools, including the Kamloops one. And so that's heartwarming. I think it's really so positive to see children. They seem to be enjoying their experience, and I've had the pleasure of talking with people who've attended those schools. And yet, it's fascinating that during the listening process of the TRC process, these public meetings where people came through them, the whole storytelling seemed to turn in a very negative way. And one of them is that I was surprised to learn within the book, Grave Error, that if someone made claims of abuse, there was never any verification or even examination of that claim. It was just taken at face value. Is that true?
As far as I know, yes. What they did check to make sure that the student had actually attended that school at the time that was claimed.
Okay.
And if the allegation named a particular abuser, they would check to see if that person was actually employed at the school at that time. So there were some minimal checks, but nothing in the sense of cross-examination, nothing in the sense of checking factual details beyond the most superficial of, were you at the school or not? So yeah, and there was big dollars on the table. The basic payment was $10,000 a year just for having attended the school. But then if you could make out some sort of claim of physical or sexual abuse, you were up in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. I mean, large amount of money. So there were a lot of incentives for people to, I won't say to lie, I don't have that evidence, but certainly the incentive was there for people to highlight their account.
It really begs that question, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So in that context, there were people that came forward and came forward with some really heart-wrenching stories of abuse or and in some cases, horrific claims like children being thrown into furnaces. I do recall there were even stories made about Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip attending residential schools and kidnapping children. I mean, the stories went from believable to unbelievable. And this is just hard to understand. So what was happening there? Is this a kind of a piling on effect or psychology? Like, how do you explain? Like there was even an essay, as I recall, is done by Dr. Rod Clifton and Jaime Rubenstein, looking at the whole question of the deliberate poisoning of children through the into food, like the children's milk. I mean, it was just absurd. So there are all these claims.
Well, this is from people at Saddle Lake who are in the news again with alleged claims of another discovery.
When in fact, as I understood, the facts were they were trying to add additional vitamins to the milk so that children, because they cared for, and I'm sure many of them loved the children, so that they would actually do better nutritionally. So it's all just a kind of a cynical perversion, almost, if I can use that word, of the story, and it's kind of hard to believe.
Well, I would point to two factors. One is the presence of money as an incentive. The parallel with the TRC, there was the claims process, which got underway about the same time as the TRC. So people would appear before the TRC, tell their stories. That was kind of a dry run for submitting the story to the to the TRC, or to the Claims Commission for getting financial reimbursement. So there is the effect of money and the absence of any real checking, fact checking, and then there's the atmosphere that was created. You invite thousands of people to attend these meetings, and they come in groups, and you make an announcement. You say, we know this is going to be hard. Like people are going to be triggered. We have counselors ready. I mean, the whole works.
But
so
in that
kind
context,
of support each other in telling more extreme stories.
Indeed. So, but part of that context, though, Tom, doesn't it beg the question, if someone made those kinds of horrific claims of fantastic abuse, like the whole idea of children being thrown into furnaces as an example. I mean, it's hard to believe it's all of the Holocaust. Would you not, as a commissioner, I mean, there were commissioners, the chair, Sinclair is a lawyer no less, would they not have referred these horrific claims promptly to the RCMP for investigation so that those who undertook those crimes would be prosecuted and justice would be held?
Well, I don't know that the most extreme claims were made in front of the commission or not. I mean, certainly extreme enough, but like some of the crazy stuff about Queen Elizabeth kidnapping children or children hanging on meat hooks.
Yeah.
Some of these claims are outside the commission. They're not really claims, they're stories that are outside the commission process. Many of them are connected with the enigmatic figure of Kevin Annett, the defrocked United Church minister, who we don't know to what extent he made up these stories or whether he heard them, but he then repeated them, went across the country, helped to carry them around. And some of these have gotten into the media. So the commissioners didn't necessarily hear those most extreme stories. If the commission report only mentions, I believe, one case of alleged murder from a woman named Doris Young. In general, the most extreme claims did not get into the commission's report.
But I guess what I'm getting at, Tom, though, is what I'm trying to get at is that with the TRC process, you have coming out of that a myriad of claims of abuse. And yet, to my knowledge, and I think this is referenced in your book, there was not one criminal referral from the TRC to the police. Is that correct?
They were prohibited by their terms of reference from doing that.
But why? Why would that be? Why would you not refer? Well,
it was the drafters of the terms of reference were afraid that if they made criminal referrals a possibility, that people would start to lawyer up, and then the whole thing would become a quagmire. So they were, at this point, there were tens of thousands of claimants lining up, and they wanted something that could come to an end. The background to this was, I think I mentioned this earlier, that there were lawyers in the 1990s were starting to line up to file class actions on behalf of various groups of so-called survivors. And these class actions were kind of indiscriminate. You sue everybody in sight. We'll sue the church. We'll sue the government.
Okay.
The churches were afraid of being bankrupt. I mean, literally afraid of being bankrupted. They didn't feel, rightly or wrongly, they didn't feel they could defend themselves. So they tried to pass everything off to the government, and the government finally accepted that. But they wanted to, have a finite process that would come to an end someday.
Okay.
So they went for sort of a streamlined thing, and that included leaving criminal referrals out of it.
All right. So part of the context as well for the claim regarding mass graves, as you know so well, has been then that these mass graves reflect the story, the other claim that there were thousands of missing and murdered children that attended these schools. And it's fascinating because a team of researchers, including yourself and including researchers such as Nina Green, have done an incredible job, and this is illustrated in your book, have found the death certificates for those that are publicly available that clearly show a story that there don't appear to be any missing Aboriginal children. Is that right, Tom? Can you help us understand that? And we have an example here that we do want to show of a individual who was on that list of missing Aboriginal children. And here's their certificate that seems to indicate that their resting place, and you can see the certificate is signed off by a physician and also the parents, who must have been heartbroken by the child's death, but it was by an accident, and that the child is in their resting place on the reserve, where you think they would logically be. And this seems to be the pattern, is that they're not missing. So help us understand what was really going on here, Tom.
Yeah, well, Nina Green deserves the credit for that line of research, and I have to say other people deserve almost all the credit for the book. I was just an editor. Other people did most of the actual hard digging. To take Kamloops as an example, the Royal Commission identified 51 children who died at Kamloops. Now, again, they use an ample definition of dying at Kamloops to include within a year after attending. So now, the claim that we started the show with was that there were 215 graves. So right away, you have this discrepancy. How could the Royal Commission, with all its resources, have missed over 150 dead children? I mean, they were looking. They made a big deal out of compiling this list of dead children, and they only came up with 51. But they didn't take the next step of trying to find out what records existed to explain the disposition of the remains of these children who died. So that's where Nina came in. She started checking British Columbia vital statistics, or whatever precisely it's called in your province, and she found records for not every single one of the 51, but for most. Let's say 35 or 40. I can't remember the exact number. Most of the children are recorded with the cause of death. It's usually something sad but not sinister, like tuberculosis or maybe accidental drowning or whatever. The cause of death is recorded, and then the disposition of the remains, whether buried, usually sent to their home reserve. Sometimes that wasn't possible if the home reserve was far away and death occurred in the winter. Sometimes burial would take place. For example, there's a community cemetery, church cemetery, which is not part of the residential school, but it's not that far away. A few were buried there. The school itself had no cemetery that's recorded. But in most cases, the record existed. So there were no missing children. I think what there were, David, there were a lot of forgotten children. Over time, people forget. I don't know whether you've ever done any family history, but I have. And I was amazed to discover that the original Thomas Flanagan was a little boy of about 2 years old who died around 1850 in LaSalle, Illinois. And the name persisted down to the present day and has been recycled in my family. But the existence of this child had been completely forgotten until I started going through records. So I think that's probably, a lot of the statements that if you look carefully, people are saying, my grandmother knew somebody who went to school but never came back. This kind of vague statement. So let's face it, who actually is missing? Nobody's come up with a list of genuinely missing children, of kids who just disappeared. There are lists of children who died, which is sad in itself, but not of children who disappeared. And Indian parents are like other parents; they love their children.
Yes,
kids just disappear.
They would be there. Yes,
they're going to do something about it.
Exactly. See, and part of this is confusing as well because you had later the emergence of the chair of the TRC, Murray Sinclair, make public statements that there were thousands and thousands of murdered and missing Aboriginal children. So it's like there's these figures that are thrown out that don't seem to be based on any kind of fact that I can locate even within the TRC report itself, which also has its own problems, as you've alluded to. So this is really quite a kind of a mess when it comes to these kinds of assertions, is it not?
Yeah, this was a highly irresponsible thing for Murray Sinclair to say. I think he said there was possibly 25,000 missing children when his own commission came up with a list of about 2,500 children who had died at the schools, but even that was padded, we could tell. He's never really substantiated his number, but other members of the commission threw out other large numbers without any evidence. And of course, once they're out there, they get picked up and recycled in the media, and you keep seeing them over and over, and they start to look like some people will take them as fact. There are no missing children that I know of. Dead children, yes. Missing children in the sense that we don't know what happened to the just gone.
Mm-hmm.
No.
Exactly. And I think that you and so many others, including retired Judge Brian Giesbrecht, have done some brilliant analysis and essay work saying that, the good news is that we're finding the, quote, missing Aboriginal children. So it is truly a remarkable story and set of claims. And I think part of this is what I find disturbing is that these kinds of claims that don't seem to be grounded on reality and facts really take away from the facts and stories, both positive and negative, that people attended residential schools with. And I think that it behooves us, you're a student of history as well, for us to learn from our history so that we can ensure that these things don't happen again. And yet, if we're coming up with kind of delusional types of commentary or narrative, we're not really serving anyone, are we, Tom?
No. Anybody who looks carefully at the education of Native people today in Canada, when most of it is actually controlled by the local governments, the band councils, they will say that the standards are a disgrace.
Yeah.
That the schools are not doing a good job.
Exactly.
So, we really need to find out what, if anything, will work, rather than emphasizing the real or imaginary faults of the past. There's a tendency today to blame everything on residential schools. Criminals appear in court and say, well, my grandmother was in residential school. This is part of the Gladue process that I deserve special consideration. That's become routine now for people charged with crimes.
Well, and what I'm also amazed by is that you take then this narrative and you continue to amp it up year after year to a point now where you're throwing out words such as genocide. So Canada becomes a genocidal nation. The first Prime Minister of Canada, an extraordinary Prime Minister, far from perfect, but an extraordinary Prime Minister, is being vilified, and we as a country are really being slandered. Our flags are going half-mast for 6 months, and meanwhile, the narrative is falling apart regarding these mass grave claims, is it not?
Yeah, I know. It's what can I say? Well, the original title of the book was going to be a little bit different. The title "Grave Error" was suggested by Candace Malcolm, and I think it was a brilliant idea, and I think it has helped the book sell. It's selling like hotcakes, really, through Amazon.
That's great.
And I think the title is a good part of that.
And I should just clarify that Candace Malcolm and the True North team, as well as the Dorchester Review, were the publishers of this book.
They were the publishers of the book, and Candace and her people came up with, and I think it was Candace personally. We were going to use something about including the word moral panic, which is more of an academic concept, but it does. Moral panic is a good term to describe an aspect of human behavior which recurs from time to time, in which large numbers of people will believe something which on the face of it seems absurd, but they will believe it and they will act upon it, and it will lead them to do strange things. And that's really what has happened here, is we're having a moral panic about residential schools, and in particular about the unmarked graves and the missing children.
So within that context, Tom, we want to learn from this, and we thought we'd go through a little bit of an overview analysis of some of the institutions that how this kind of irrational moral panic could happen. How is it that we would put aside our critical thinking faculties and simply accept such a massive claim regarding mass graves, pardon the pun, and not really do diligence? In a normal world, we would refer this matter to the RCMP, the police, and we'd excavate and respectfully look at the evidence like we would for any criminal claim. But that has not happened, and so the claim is falling apart. And we have a clip here. It's going around the world from a news network here that breaks down this claim.
There are new developments regarding a 2021 story out of Canada. At the time, reports said there were mass graves of Indigenous children found at residential schools in the North American country. Some of those schools were run by the Catholic Church. According to a new report, the recent excavation of 14 alleged burial sites unearthed no human remains. We go now to Colin Flynn, EWTN News Vatican correspondent. Colin, great to be with you. First off, can you tell us more about these new developments in the story that we just mentioned?
A very good evening, Tracy. Yes, indeed, I can. Well, 2 years ago, after stories dominated the headlines around the world about alleged mass graves of Indigenous children at former residential schools right across Canada, it is now believed that the stories of these mass graves could be false after excavations have turned up no human remains. And you'll remember Pope Francis, he travelled to Canada last year, and indeed I went on that trip with the Holy Father. We reported on it extensively here on EWTN. There in Canada, the Pope apologised for the Church's role in the residential school system and the reported abuse of many of its members. The Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau demanded that the Vatican apologise for its role in the scandal in relation to the mass graves. Well, 2 years after the original stories of the mass graves broke, a series of recent excavations at suspected sites has turned up no human remains. Now, this has led many academics and politicians to say it's further evidence that the stories are unproven.
Okay, so as we look at that kind of clip, it begs the question, Tom, about were we surprised? And what about our institutions? Are we in serious trouble that they have left leave of their faculty of critical thinking skills, to put it mildly, or are they been, frankly, taken captive by some form of ideology? It's hard to say. But let's just look at a number of institutions here quickly. We look at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission itself. It's a interesting report. It's some 3,200 pages. And what I find fascinating is that the summary of the report is really, in my mind, not a very accurate summary at all of the original report. And yet a lot of people seem to think that that is actually the report. And so within that summary of a mere 300 pages, not 3,200 pages, it's almost like there's a kind of a sleight of hand going on here. Am I seeing a kind of a failure in basic process when it comes to honoring, ironically, the TRC report itself?
Mm-hmm. Well, what's in the background of all this, and I think explains a lot of it, is the ascendancy of the woke or progressive ideology, according to which the world is divided into oppressors and oppressed. And the ultimate oppressors, of course, are white males. And there can be various oppressed categories, but Native people are certainly prominent among them. So if you're educated in this ideology, and has become more and more predominant, or not just in the universities, but in school systems, then claims about oppression seem plausible. Mm-hmm. So this, as this ideology has permeated universities, schools, churches, the media, even institutions like civil service and police, you get authorities across the board rushing to accept the latest claim of oppression because it fits into all their preconceived notions about, that they derive from their worldview. So that's, I think, the ultimate explanation of how these institutions are breaking down. Then within each institution, you'll have separate explanations. I mean, for example, I'm pretty sure that the Mounties realize this is all nonsense and they don't want any part of it. So they just say, well, the reserve authorities have to take the lead or something like that, So they just want to not be involved. Politicians, remember, because it's only 2 years ago that the House of Commons voted to declare residential schools a genocide. They voted unanimously. Yeah, it's one of these fake votes. It wasn't legislation, it was a resolution. And it was just kind of agreed among the leadership of the various parties. So the Liberals and the NDP above all were pushing it, and the Conservatives, who you might expect to oppose it, decided that it was too hot a topic. They would just let it slide.
Mm-hmm.
So the leadership of the Conservative Party told all their members to vote for it. I don't know if anybody took it seriously, but nonetheless, they're on record
Mm-hmm.
as declaring the schools to be genocidal. So
Yeah.
the politicians have their own. Some of them see it as a positive vote getter. Others may see it as just a way to avoid trouble.
But what an absurd posture to take if evidence and truth matter, or the rule of law. Like, we don't just simply go along with resolutions because someone says we're genocidal. I mean, this is just the wake of an example of just woke absurdity. It's bizarre.
It is.
The other side to this, Tom, is the role of professions. I think of well, let's take educators, for instance. It seemed like within a matter of weeks, months perhaps, there were on so many chain link fences of schools across this country, thousands of little orange ribbons going up, signifying that people cared and that every child matters. And of course, every child matters. But to assert that in elementary schools, and I've even seen schools where they were showing every single claim of mass graves across the country. And this is an elementary school. And I would ask those educators, I would ask those school psychologists, where are they when it comes to setting forth that type of horrible narrative in front of children? The whole notion that you belong to a country that is genocidal and doesn't care about children. So to me, this is just begs serious questions about your take on mental health and the welfare of children, does it not?
Well, there's so much blame to go around. We can point at the educational profession. Before we leave the topic, I meant to point out earlier in connection with the Kamloops announcement, the young woman who was pushing the GPR around is a professor of anthropology at one of the BC universities. She got her PhD at Simon Fraser. Talk about abuse of science. She took the contract, which is fine. People deserve to get paid for their work, and she did the work. But she never actually delivered a report in public. The only thing that the public heard was a press conference staged by the chief and other speakers on behalf of the band. The media can't get to this young woman. She's been told not to talk to the media. So she has lent the prestige of using a legitimate scientific device, the GPR, for a purpose without proper explanation.
Well, and what about Simon Fraser University, the Department of Archaeology not sharing their many years of archaeological investigations of the Kamloops site?
Yes.
They're a taxpayer-supported institution. Why would they not be coming forward with that information in a fair and transparent fashion out of respect for all these claims and the Canadian people?
Yeah. So, there's an abuse on the part of scientific professionals, educational professionals, legal professionals who are involved in imposing a gag order on the scientists who did the work. All I can say is this is the kind of thing you expect in a moral panic. You just expect a lot of people to do things that they wouldn't normally do.
Right. But for me, the bottom line is that very few in this mess are left defending what should be defended first, which is the truth, which should be evidence out of respect for everyone involved, including those who attended residential schools. And I think this is the paradox of our time, is it not, Tom? That we have a whole myriad, an army of people, whether it's due to financial interests or otherwise, or ideology, pursuing a nonsensical claim that has no basis in evidence.
Yeah, and almost sort of to substantiate that, almost all of us who are involved with this book, with maybe one or two exceptions, almost all of us are retired.
Doesn't that say
We're
something?
beyond punishment. We can't lose our jobs because we've retired. You know, Janis Joplin sang freedom is just another name for nothing left to lose.
Wow.
So thank goodness for old age and retirement, that it leaves a class of people that, at least for the time being, are immune to these pressures. But, you know, several of the authors in our book are going confidential. Nina Green, who knows what her real name is, the author of the thing about the septic system, published it anonymously. You know, people are really afraid of reprisals.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah.
And,
Well, and what I find abhorrent is that you have a myriad of people who served in those residential schools, including Aboriginal staff people, nuns and priests, who were honorable people, who went there out of a sense of service, who lived, frankly, in poverty in many cases, out of a love for not only their God, but serving those children. And those are very heartwarming stories. And then to vilify them, and so many of them have passed on, there's no one there to defend them except a handful of people. Now, I did have the occasion to meet with a UK documentary film crew, because there are a number of news outlets in Canada, there are very few of them, that are speaking about this issue, and I think in a journalistic fashion. But on the international side, I spoke with this UK documentary crew, and they did. This is a clip. You know, there's been no evidence found to date, and they're usually shocked and surprised. Others are kind of suspicious and say, well, yeah, that kind of makes sense. I've kind of wondered whether there's really been any evidence. But we run on facts and evidence in civilization. The rule of law. We don't just run on speculation or hearsay. And it seems like Canadians are just missing, or some Canadians are missing, the entire plot.
But it makes sense if you live in a country that has a high trust society, where people generally trust that what you're saying is true. And when your political leaders on both sides and the Pope say something, you would expect that it's true, right? So I can understand why people wouldn't question what they're saying, what their leaders are telling them. I mean, you grow up in this this miracle of a society, of a Western country where everything works very well and people trust each other.
Right.
But unfortunately, in Canada, and to a certain extent in Britain and other countries, politicians are undermining this high trust society, this, as you say, the rule of law, the belief in truth, the belief in fact, and are undermining that by pushing false narratives. And I think it's a complete disaster for our structures as societies, for Western civilization, when you have political leaders pushing lies and trying to punish people who disagree with them, you know, using evidence and facts and logic with the law. And that is authoritarianism. And that's what happens in authoritarian countries. That is what happens in communist societies, in communist dictatorships. So I think it's very, very concerning. And that's why we wanted to look into this Kamloops issue.
Well, before we get into some larger questions about what's really going on here, I did want to ask you, Stephen, on the claim regarding mass graves, and there's been no, as you said, no evidence found to date. How is that played in the UK or in larger Europe? Is that known as a story, and how do people view that?
I think to an extent it's known in the UK. And as I said, there has been reporting on this ever since the Kamloops band made their claims in 2021. And particularly through various conservative publications, less so in the more liberal media, there has been, I think, a bemusement of what's going on in Canada. A sort of how can this possibly be happening? And I think people find it utterly surreal. It's completely bizarre, and they read this story and they think, "Gosh, that's just absolutely. It's just weird." It's just weird that you have all these politicians making these statements without any evidence. And I think, you know, to be so blatant in it, and to refuse to dig up these grave sites to prove what they're saying, the fact that they're refusing to do that, I think people in Britain look at that and they just think this is very, very strange.
So the point is that on the international side, it's almost like Canada's being made a mockery, that so many of us are not able to speak up for the truth. And this is really quite embarrassing. So I also think of Dr. Nigel Bigger, a professor at Oxford. I think he's in history and theology, who talks about colonialism and how it seems like there were obviously good and bad things about colonialism, but this whole Marxist historian movement that seems to vilify colonialism top to bottom is really, I think he shares a very powerful insight. And Bigger says that activists don't care about facts or the truth of the past, he observed. In Canada, have we lost our ability as historians to remember our history based on facts?
Well, all I can say is, sadly, the historical profession, I think that's true of a majority. They're some of the worst offenders. The historical profession a couple of years ago put out a letter condemning residential schools as genocidal. They were ahead of the game. The real authority on the schools is Jim Miller, who actually has written a couple of books about them, but he can't even get published anymore on this topic. He's given up. So the real authorities are shut out or shut down, and then the people who don't actually know what they're talking about start to take over and talk as if they do. And it's a very sad situation. So again, bright spots. Are there any bright spots? Well, a couple. One, the existence of let's call it alternative media like True North, which are not controlled by the academic establishment, that are willing to take a chance on a book like ours. They're nimble, they can move quickly. So that it's hard to shut up the truth completely, because there are these alternative outlets, and they come in many flavors. There's Ezra Levant. Well, he's too excitable for some, but he's part of a broad picture of alternative outlets, which allow the truth to kind of sneak out there, even when the Globe and Mail or CBC, they won't touch the story, but these alternative outlets will. So that's a bright spot. And I guess I'd like to say I'm a conservative. I'm never optimistic, but I'm always hopeful.
Indeed.
So I do have some hope.
Well, we certainly see signs of hope, and we encourage fellow citizens to purchase the book, Grave Error, and we encourage them to use their critical thinking skills to look at this issue. And for me, I think this is a very important issue because it does relate to facts and evidence and truth and history of our nation. We live in an incredible country, and it seems like this is all part of an effort to, I think, frankly, vilify our story and vilify Canadians. Do you think that that's actually what they're trying to do here?
Oh, yeah. Sure. A lot of the people who are most vociferous about residential schools are also quite honest about the fact that they think Canada is an illegitimate country. It's, Canada with a K, settler colonialism. They've got a long list of words for it. So yeah, buy the book. It's not that expensive, and Canadians want to buy this book. This book has been on Amazon Canada's bestseller list from the day it was released. December the 5th, I think, was the first day you could buy it. And it has been right at the top of bestsellers in various subfields. Even sometimes, some days it's been the best-selling book overall in Canada.
Wow.
So people want to buy this book, even though there's no coverage at all in the mainstream media, except for a column by Barbara Kay on Saturday. We're not being pushed by the CBC and the Globe and Mail or anybody else. It's just people hearing about this book and they want to buy it. So I hope that some of our listeners here will follow up on that.
Well, that's positive news. So on behalf of all of us, thank you so much, Thomas Flanagan, for joining us today. And thank you for your leadership, as well as so many others, as you work as a team to find the truth. And that's certainly what we're here for. So thank you for joining us for today's discussion.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure, David. Thanks.
Thank you for watching Leaders on the Frontier. We're a nonpartisan think tank. We explore ideas, policy, and practical solutions that can make a difference in the lives of Canadians. We do not accept any government funding. We work for you. Thank you for supporting Frontier. Visit fcpp.org to give. While you're there, be sure to check out our latest articles and research. Without open discussion and debate, you're not thinking, nor are you free. Comment below. We'd love for you to join the conversation.